This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include John Locke Foundation's Becki Gray, John Hood from the John Locke Foundation also, Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, and former state senator, former chairman of the board, State Board of Education, former mayor of Chapel Hill. We've got to shorten your title here, Howard Lee.
Absolutely.
We got a good show for you this week, starting with a look at the elections, some 8 weeks away. We're going to talk about the governor allowing the coal ash bill to become law without his signature, and we'll look at the recent end-of-grade test scores. And as always, we'll ask our panel to tell us something we don't know, so let's get started. Labor Day is the traditional start of the election season, but the U.S. Senate race has been raging for months. With 8 weeks to go before the general election, we want to find out where things stand. Becki Gray, obviously the headliner is the U.S. Senate race, already the most expensive in our state's history and might well determine whether Republicans or Democrats control the Senate. But the News and Observer called this an empty race because it had no real content. Even in the recent debate, there wasn't a lot of content. Why aren't the candidates talking about real issues?
Well, Tom, I would disagree with you. I think they are talking about issues. They are talking about their leadership skills and what they bring to the table. You know, these are not a couple of novices to public service, to leadership in government. They both have strong records to run on. What we see from Senator Kay Hagan, she, of course, served in the state Senate for a number of years before running and winning this Senate seat. She has clearly aligned herself with President Obama. She votes with him most of the time. She has come out as an advocate for Obamacare. So these health care issues are very much on the table. With Speaker Tillis, he also has a record that he's running on, one of reform, change, more of an aggressive kind of leadership. Kay Hagan has described herself as a moderate. I think that I would describe Speaker Tillis as more aggressive. He has a record of tax reform, regulatory reform, reforms here in North Carolina. I think there's a tremendous amount of content in this race, and those that are saying that there aren't perhaps are unhappy with their candidate.
But you got to admit there are a lot of national issues that are taking place, and this would be an ideal place for the candidates to be telling us, Howard, what their stance is on ISIS and what their stance is on Afghanistan and some of these other issues, as well as, I mean, we got a federal highway transportation system that's going broke. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Am I wrong about that?
No, I was very disappointed with the fact that they didn't focus more on substantive issues.
Part of it was they didn't get asked them.
Well, that's true, but I would like to have heard some thoughts about what's going on in the Middle East that has implications for us. But also, I think we've got to put more emphasis, as you've just mentioned, on the infrastructure problems we have, and the federal government's going to have to play a much greater role in helping us resolve these problems. It can't be left just to states.
Chris, there was a lot of comment after the debate about Tom Tillis addressing Kay Hagan as Kay, Senator Hagan as Kay, and also over women's issues. How did you see these comments?
Well, I mean, it was obviously a conscious choice that Speaker Tillis addressed Senator Hagan as Kay, and Senator Hagan addressed Speaker Tillis as Speaker Tillis. I think it feeds into a narrative that's already been established that there are people that believe Speaker Tillis is vulnerable in women's issues because of a bill that restricted abortion rights and some other issues in the General Assembly. So this sort of plays into the narrative if you're a Kay Hagan supporter. I thought Michael Bitzer, the political scientist at Catawba College, said recently this feels more like a presidential campaign than it does a Senate race, where we have a deluge of ads from the outside. The debate itself was sort of a repetition of the ads, and I disagree a little bit with Becki. It's almost they were sort of both of them, but were parroting their ads.
Sound bites.
Right, and I mean, and really, this race comes down to, Becki talked a lot about President Obama. The Republicans clearly want Kay Hagan to be identified with President Obama. The Democrats want the Speaker Tillis identified with what is a very unpopular General Assembly, and that's what this election is about.
All right, John, 2 polls released this past week show that this election is just neck and neck.
It is.
It's within the margin of error, irrespective of what poll you've been looking at. So the real question is, who's going to show up in November to vote? Who's going to get their constituencies out? It's been assumed Hagan's going to get the women and the minorities, Tillis the white males. How do you see this, and do you see it breaking any differently, and who do you think is actually going to get activated and turn out?
Well, first of all, when we get into the demographic breakdown with elections, it's important to remember that a vote is a vote. You win when you get the most votes. It doesn't matter which percentage of which group you get, it's when you get the most votes. Kay Hagan is leading among women. Tom Tillis is leading among men. Women and men are almost the same share of the electorate. So people get carried away. I mean, how many discussions have we got about Kay Hagan's problem with male voters and how she just can't connect with them, and she's down by 18, 20 points among male voters? You don't hear that, but a vote is a vote. Now, when it comes to November, we don't really know yet, but what we're starting to see when you look at polls around the country and in North Carolina, as pollsters move from registered voters to likely voters, you're seeing a very common 2 to 3 point shift in favor of Republicans. Now, Republicans get excited about that, need to understand that in 2010, when they had a big wave, that shift would have been 5, 6, 7 points. So it's not like 2010.
This isn't an avalanche.
No, but it is also a clear Republican trend.
Becki, I need to raise the question. Last week, the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed to hear a lawsuit that was brought by several groups trying to block the election laws that the legislature passed in 2013. They're going to have a hearing on this September 27th. The question is whether the new laws are suppressing minority voting. The U.S. District Court Judge Thomas Schroeder said no. What do you expect from the Fourth Circuit?
I don't know. I'm surprised that they're bringing it up this late in the game, to be honest with you. It seems to me that the election rules should apply during an election cycle, and that election cycle should begin with the primary, and all of those rules should carry through whatever that election is for that year. I'm surprised that they're bringing it up at this late date. I mean, we are just weeks away from voting, mail-in voting and those kind of things.
Well,
so
mail-in's already started.
Yeah, it seems to me pretty late in the day to be changing the rules here.
Howard, on another end of this discussion on elections, we talked recently on the show about the 19 candidates running for the Court of Appeals race. The Republican Party came out this past week and endorsed John Tyson, one of the candidates that's running, a former member of the Court of Appeals. What do you think of their actions, and do you think the Democrats should jump in and make a similar endorsement?
Well, I personally think we should push as hard as we can to keep our judgeships as nonpartisan as we possibly can. I just feel like we are already on very thin ice when it comes to the way we select our judges. And frankly, I would like to see us take a more serious approach and not take it more toward the political partisan era.
For those of you saying you'd like to have more NC Spin, I've got some news. You can have additional video content from our panel and other leading opinion makers on our website, ncspin.com. We always ask our panel after the show what they wish they'd said on the show, as well as we give comments from other topics. So I invite you to join in, ncspin.com, ncspin on Facebook, and of course at NCSpin Tweets. Balanced debate for the Old North State. After these messages, we're going to talk about the coal ash bill.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
My name is Bernie Teal. Sunburst Farms has been in my family for over 35 years. Last year I had to do something I'd never done before. Destroy 10 acres of good squash. I wasn't able to find enough workers. The opportunity is there. American families are demanding locally grown vegetables, and I want to provide that to them. So please tell Congress that we need immigration reform now.
Your family physician supports Medicaid reform. That's good for North Carolina patients, providers, and taxpayers.
For over a year, we've worked with the Governor and the General Assembly on a plan for responsible Medicaid reform.
The Senate's proposed Medicaid changes are a departure from this plan. Changes that could lead to a decrease in the number of primary care physicians providing care in communities that need them the most.
The destruction of our state's medical home network, a network that prevents unnecessary hospital and emergency room visits,
and disregards the elderly, the blind, and disabled, and the health care they need. Care we're morally and legally obligated to provide.
Now is not the time to disregard the progress we've made. Now is the time for lawmakers to implement responsible Medicaid reform that protects and improves health care for all North Carolinians.
Visit rnchealthcare.com and tell your lawmaker to support responsible Medicaid reform.
We now return to NC Spin.
You might remember Governor Pat McCrory appeared on NC Spin days after the legislature had left town and talked about the coal ash bill the lawmakers passed. While he was complimentary of most of the bill, he did raise questions about the constitutionality of the commission the bill created to oversee the cleanup. Now, there were three actions he could have taken on that bill. First, he could have signed it into law. Secondly, he could veto it and send it back to the legislature. Or third, he could do nothing, in which case it became law anyway. Well, he chose the latter. John, talk to us about the impact of what the governor did. The bill has become law. If he had signed it, would it have weakened his case for a possible lawsuit?
Well, probably not. I think he wanted to be consistent with the argument that he and his aides have been making now for weeks, if not months, that there's an encroachment on the executive branch's authority when you have legislators appointing members to panels that act as regulators. I kind of see both sides here, because on the one hand, if you think about the basic separation of powers between legislative, executive, and judicial, a lot of these regulatory oversight agencies are acting in an administrative capacity. And if we were talking about the president and Congress, it would be very straightforward that Congress is encroaching on the power of the chief executive. The problem in North Carolina is that we have so much history of legislators appointing members to boards that govern various kinds of things.
But
and
not controlling numbers.
What, the legislature?
Yeah.
What about the Board of Governors?
Well, okay, they have all of the authority on that particular board.
And then they have lots of other authority, lots of other appointees and other boards. I don't think the governor is arguing that if he had a different mix of appointees, that would be the end of the story. There's an argument about the whole concept, and I think that this is a good example where you really ought to seek, in this case, an advisory opinion.
Chris, the governor said he was going to go to the North Carolina Supreme Court and ask them for an advisory opinion as to whether or not this was a separation of powers problem. You've been around this block for a few times. I've never seen that happen before. Have you? And what's he likely to get from that?
I'm not sure he'll get an advisory opinion. If he doesn't get one, he said he'll probably file a lawsuit, which I assume would then be heard by a 3-judge panel, because it's questioning the constitutionality of a bill passed by the General Assembly. So the Chief Justice, he just named Chief Justice, will appoint a 3-judge panel to hear a lawsuit by the governor. Which I think will be the first test of that law.
Howard, you served in the legislature for a long time, and as John said, the legislature has been making appointments to many boards and commissions, but the governor says the executive branch is supposed to oversee these boards, and if something happens and it goes wrong, the executive branch won't have the authority to be able to go in and clean it up if the legislature is appointing most of the members. Is that a legitimate argument from your experience?
I think that's a little weak, because if there is a stronger relationship between the governor and the legislature, there would be a great deal more trust. And trust, seems to me, through the years has been the rule, that you could meet with the leadership, and we've seen governors who've been able to do that, from even Jim Martin, when he was serving with a majority legislature, he was able to work through that. So I think it's probably a little weak argument.
All right, so Becki, where are we with this thing? The bill is now law, even though the governor didn't sign it. I assume the coal ash cleanup is to begin, but there's so much controversy over this commission. Is that going to be formed? Are the people going to be named? Is it going to be able to function?
Well, what I understand is, as the governor seeks this advisory opinion from the Supreme Court, the bill goes forward, or the legislation goes forward as it's outlined in the bill. One of the first reports is due back to the General Assembly on October 1st of 2014.
Yes.
So this is kind of a short time frame to get members appointed, get members appointed, get it done. Plus, I think there's a real interest on behalf of the General Assembly, the governor, and certainly the public, that this coal ash cleanup process get underway and begin, and not be tied up in court for an indefinite amount of time.
All right, after these messages, we're going to talk about test scores.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Hi, I'm Linda Loveland. I want the best for my kids. Feeding them foods they like within my budget is a priority. But what do we really know about these foods? North Carolina farmers and food experts give you a website to find it all. FeedTheDialogueNC.com, a place where moms like you and me can learn more about the foods we eat and the farmers that feed us. Check it out. Add your input and help feed the dialogue. Let's talk food at FeedTheDialogueNC.com.
The best part about being a member of a Touchstone Energy cooperative is that it's your Touchstone Energy cooperative. Learn more about the power of your co-op membership at TogetherWeSave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
We now return to NC Spin.
Well, we've gotten the test scores back from the end of grade tests last year, and at first glance, it appears our schools made great gains. The overall state passing rate was 56.3% compared to last year's 44.7%. Then we learned that the scoring system was changed from last year, making it easier to pass the test. So we can't accurately compare this year to last. Howard Lee, you've been around this education business for a long time. We say we want accountability, but every time we get close to being able to measure performance, we change the curriculums, redesign the test, change the scoring system. Are we ever going to be able to measure accurately how well our students are doing?
Well, I'm praying so, but we have had this problem for quite a long time. We've had more educational initiatives in this state than Carter has Little Liver Pills. But
a lot of people don't remember Carter's Little Liver Pills, Howard.
The only time that I can recall when we really saw some solid and sincere progress was during the Jim Hunt era, when he was able to keep the legislature from jumping in and making a lot of changes through legislation. We saw great growth during that time. Since Jim Hunt, we have had a lot of different changes and different initiatives that I think have just really kind of thrown things out of kilter.
John, you wrote a column this week that I found to be very intriguing, in which you mentioned all of the different initiatives going back to the ABCs and Senate Bill 2,
right.
And
basic education
program and Common Core and More at 4 and Smart Start and all of this kind of good stuff.
The real ladder.
Oh boy, I'll tell you, it seems like the initiative du jour in public education. What's your take on this? Are we ever going to find out how well the kids are actually doing?
Well, first of all, we need to do that. We need to have an independent assessment in every grade that the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction and local districts have nothing to do with. We have
and they can't play with the cut scores.
That's correct. We have every other year a sample of 4th and 8th graders that take the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They've been doing that since the early 90s. That's valuable, and it actually supports what Senator Lee was saying. The period where North Carolina actually made substantial gains versus the national and regional average is the 90s, the beginning of the 90s and through to the 98 and 2000 tests. After that, our progress peters out, particularly in reading it disappears. In math, we continue to make some gains, but not as fast as the rest of the country. Now, the problem is that, it's not so much Jim Hunt's, actually most of Jim Hunt's policies went into place about the time the test scores stopped going up. I'm not blaming Governor Hunt because he was involved in education reform 20 years earlier, 15 years earlier, which clearly did have some effect. But we have got to have a very clear sense of where we are, first of all, in North Carolina, which is about average for the nation. That's better than it was 20, 30 years ago, but most of that progress was before the turn of the century. We haven't made much progress since.
So, Chris, should we have any confidence whatsoever in these test scores? And according to what the legislature just did by gutting Common Core, it looks like we're going to change the test again this year.
Well, it's fascinating. There's two competing signals here. On the one hand, we're told we need to have a lot of tests to figure out how we're doing, how we measure up, how we do every year. On the other hand, we have politicians of both parties saying we're testing our kids too often. On the one hand, we think what we need is national standards, a national test we can compare each other. Why don't we let the states get together and come up with a plan that have rigorous standards and national tests? They did that. It's called Common Core. Now we're saying, oh, we don't want to have standards that are nationally. We don't want to compare ourselves in that way to other states. So it's not just internally that the Department of Public Instruction has been changing. The political winds have been changing these, and we're sending completely contradictory things to schools and administrators and parents. I will say some of this Some of the
well, you got to feel sorry for the teachers.
Well, and some of the
changes.
schools, I do, and some of the schools have released the scores as if, like Wake County, for example, you could look and see how they would have done under last year's results, and they made small improvements, not as big as changing the scores. So it's still possible. It's just cumbersome.
Becki, the legislature, as part of their legislation, also said that every school had to get a letter grade. Now they've put off till next year grading these schools from A to F. Are we ever going to get to that, and are we going to have any confidence in it, and how's it going to be used?
Well, again, I think this is going to really meaningful assessments. That's what the General Assembly's intent is. That's what parents want. It's what teachers want. Superintendents want that as well. I think a big part of this problem lies with the fact that DPI is the one who is being tested, and at the same time, they are the ones that are administering the test, and they have a lot at stake as to what those test scores look like. So to get them out of this game, I think, is the first step to go to get really meaningful tests with this. But, you know, the way this whole thing has been rolled out, it's confusing, it's convoluted. You know, at first, we had tremendous improvement, then we didn't. I think the way that DPI has rolled this out has just added to the confusion.
And it goes back to, I think, what John or Howard once said about the trust factor.
Right.
We'll be talking about this, I'm sure,
well, the
in days
confidence
to come.
you can have in those results.
All right, after these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
Does your North Carolina business or organization have a story to tell? I'm Richard Campbell, and at Carolina Broadcasting and Publishing, we help tell stories that connect you to the people who will respond. We take the time to understand our clients' needs and what makes them unique. We craft their stories through the efficient use of words, images, and videos that resonate with their desired audience. We also know that a good story is incomplete without a call to action. On video, on air, online, and in print, from concept to final production, no one can help tell your story more effectively or affordably than we can. For special introductory offers, visit carolinabroadcasting.com or call 919-832-1416. Again, that's carolinabroadcasting.com. Let us help tell your story today.
We now return to NC Spin.
Well, one of the best parts of the show each week is when we ask our panelists to tell us something that we don't know, and they get to sound off on a topic of their choosing. Chris Fitzsimon, I'm going to start with you. Tell us something we don't know.
Well, I'll tell you something that makes me mad about what we might know. This past week, 2 inmates who had been on death row, one for 30 years, both were mentally challenged, were found to be innocent of a crime. This happened because they didn't do a fingerprint test 30 years ago. We've heard so many people, including this session of the General Assembly, say we need to speed up appeals, execute people faster. They've been on death row too long. Well, one of these guys would have probably been executed if that had happened. And my biggest outrage is that from Governor McCrory to Attorney General Roy Cooper to Speaker Tillis, the response has been, oh, we're heartened by their release. The system works. We'll give them a pardon if they apply. Where's the anger and outrage that we literally ripped 30 years?
You wrote a column about that this week. I thought it was a good column.
It's really amazing. I think it's one of the biggest scandals in our state's history. I'm disappointed that politicians of both parties haven't spoken out strongly about it.
Howard Lee, tell us something we don't know.
You know, I have great faith that we should offer opportunities for kids, and charter schools, for me, is one of those options that we should be offering. And I had real hope that under the present circumstance, we would get a much more progress in approving charter schools. But I'm learning now that it's even becoming harder for people to apply and get approved for charter schools. And I think if that holds, that will be a shame that we will miss this opportunity.
Becki Gray, tell us something we don't know.
The FDA is proposing regulations that would, in effect, close down cigar shops across the country, and we have several here in North Carolina. And these are the specialty cigar shops with the hand-rolled cigars, so cigar aficionados, and I know there are a lot of them out there. This is a good example of government regulation coming in and closing down legitimate businesses, and it's a real problem.
Political philosophy being used through the legislative and regulatory process. Wow. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, if you look at all the standard national election projection sites, the New York Times, the Washington Post, electionprojection.com, 538. If you average all of these together and you look at the U.S. Senate races, there's not even a question. The closest race in the country is the one we talked about at the beginning of the show, Tom Tillis versus Kay Hagan.
Wow.
It is essentially unpredictable. Most of these sites have it 51-49 probability.
Does anybody say why it is the closest race?
Because North Carolina is the prototypical battleground state in the nation now. We're about the median politically in the United States. About as many Republican leaners as Democratic leaners went for Obama in 2008, for Romney in 2012. We're the prototype, as I said, of.
But doesn't that say that neither of the candidates has really distanced themselves?
There are other races that are close, that are 2 points, point and a half, but Hagan tells us if you average all the likely voter polls, it's less than a point, and that is the closest in the country.
And when you have a close race like this libertarian candidate could very well have an impact on this election.
Which would be interesting. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read our weekly column, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. We hope you'll join us next week when we'll take on more issues of interest to the people of North Carolina. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.